Since we have already established in the first panel that Lula will beat Serra in 2010, less certain about the candidate, but Lula will. We will then proceed with the next three panelists. We will focus now on possible scenarios on three dimensions: the domestic policy in Brazil, how it would be under one, assuming that it's going to be either Dilma Rousseff or José Serra. It's even early for that, but let's assume that's one of the scenarios, the main scenario. What would be the outlook for domestic policy? Who would build coalitions in Brazil? As you know, in order to govern Brazil, you have to build a presidential coalition. It can be ideologically diverse, but it has to produce in Congress. President Cardoso used to say that in order to govern Brazil, you have to kill a lion a day. It is describing this very difficult process. We will also look at economic policy. Some people say it's irrelevant because all four candidates are social democrats. Well, maybe not. Maybe there would be important emphasis or changes or discontinuities depending on who gets elected. We are also going to focus on foreign policy. As you know, Brazil has become a much more prominent actor internationally in the recent past. To talk about domestic policy, we have the pleasure to have Professor Cláudio Gonçalves Couto from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, São Paulo. You have the bios, so I will ask you to read their complete information. We have also our dear friend Chris Garman, Director of Eurasia for Latin America, the dear friend who has the daring duty of trying to project outcomes all the time, and he has been doing that for a while. And I would not like to be in his position because it's a very risky thing to do. And also João Augusto de Castro Neves, a political scientist living now here in Washington, also a founding partner, a political analyst from CAC Consultoria, a dear friend. So we will start in the same format. I will ask, would you like to go first?
No, I will go.
You go to the end. Who goes first? Maybe, Chris, could you start with the economic scenarios?
Sure.
Then we do foreign policy, and Claudio will give us the political context.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to come here to present. It's always a very high quality discussion, and we certainly have a difficult act to follow after the first panel here, which was a fantastic discussion over the electoral dynamics. As Paulo suggested, I will focus my remarks today on trying to be able to unpack what exactly is at stake in this election. Right? And I think that when talking to different sets of investors or opinion makers, I think that we're in a very interesting moment when we're looking at the relevance of this year's presidential elections. If you speak to institutional investors and hedge fund managers and on Wall Street or in London or in Boston, many of which are our clients at Eurasia Group, you essentially will get, an answer that there really isn't that much at stake. that Brazil has significantly improved its macroeconomic, conditions. Its vulnerabilities are vastly reduced in comparison to the recent past. Brazil has responded and traversed the global downturn extremely favorably. It's the market darling right now. And there is a conviction amongst the community of investors that there is a strong consensus amongst the political class over the need to maintain the parameters of responsible macroeconomic policymaking. Right? And that, in other words, that the sets of economic policies that generated the preconditions for low inflation are here to stay. On the other hand, if you read the newspapers in Brazil and speak to kind of elites that are following the election, there seems to be a lot at stake. And I would just cite, the last article that was published by Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and I think in his monthly piece, where he said that actually what is at stake in this election is not only the quality of democracy, but also the nature by which capitalism will move forward in Brazil, and that essentially making the case that if the opposition wins, that the PT under the stewardship of the more ideological Dilma Rousseff will move to a more statist version of capitalism, very similar to the Chinese, with worrying trends with regard to curbing, individual liberties, as was made evident by certain proposals to introduce greater regulation over the press, and also, the PT's document on human rights, which generated a lot of at least noise in the Brazilian press. And he made the analogy that this is an election that warrants leaders to kind of invoke greater leadership skills, much like they did in the 1980s and the transition away from military rule. Right? And so you have a very polarized environment in Brazil right now amongst the political class, with accusations, suspicions that maybe Dilma will see a more ideological and leftist turn that could impact economic policy negatively. Essentially, what I'll try to argue here today is that probably neither are correct. I firmly believe that there is more at stake in this election than meets the eye from a perspective of international investors, even though I fully agree with the appraisal that the consensus for macroeconomic policies that generate low inflation is very well consolidated amongst the political class, very much for the same reasons that were spelled out in the previous panel, in terms of that there is a very strong conviction and demand for voters to have a low inflation economic environment. I think that when looking at this election, I won't focus on the election itself. That was focused on the last panel, of course. But I am of the view that Dilma Rousseff should be considered favored, even though this election is far from a done deal, of course. But in Congress specifically, I do think that Rousseff is poised, if she wins, to assume a much larger congressional majority in comparison to a Serra administration. And when it comes to the election outlook itself, I think that there probably is a lot of hyperbole and exaggeration with respect to the risks that either candidate represent post-election. One of the main concerns, I think, from the investor community on macroeconomic policy are worrying trends on fiscal policy, which continues to be expansive, which generates difficulties to facilitate environment to have lower real interest rates. But I think that investors are going to be pleasantly surprised with Dilma when it comes to how market-friendly oriented she is likely to be on fiscal policy. Although, she will have and continue the current trend towards strengthening state-owned enterprises. But that will vary a lot by sector. So we have to have a nuanced view over her administration. On the flip side, I think Serra will take a much stronger stance on fiscal policy, but some of the concerns that investors may have with regard to his ongoing criticisms and historic criticisms over exchange rate management and interest rate policies may also be somewhat overblown. But we would have, I think, a much more competitive environment and heavily regulated sectors of the economy should he win. So in sum, I think that Serra probably would generate a more higher growth environment in comparison to Rousseff. Now, why is it that, what is it that is buttressing at least some of these claims? I think that the big picture here from a political perspective that we always have to keep in mind is that, when we look at, what are the drivers to economic policy making in Brazil over the past 15, 20 years, right? And a lot of the drivers to economic policy have in part been a function of market constraints, of macroeconomic constraints. In a context where Brazil investors have significant concerns over the ability of the Brazilian government to meet their debt obligations. This generated, where you have high fiscal vulnerability, politicians were forced to a very austere line, both on fiscal policy and on monetary policy, just to generate the conditions for low inflation. And if you didn't, it was a political killer, right? And so here you have, of course, a process where, as Alberto made very clear, Cardoso won in '94 based on a low inflation platform. Won re-election in '98 in part due to incumbency advantages, but also, carrying through on the successes of the Real plan. Lula did not win on a low inflation platform, but his entire political agenda during his first term in office were driven by the requisites of macroeconomic stabilization. He had significant investor concerns, so he had to have a very austere and orthodox, central bank directors, at least the nominations. They had to have a primary surplus target higher than during the Cardoso years, and had to send to Congress a pension reform. In other words, the political agenda was still driven by the requisites of stabilizing the economy, right? Now, of course, that wasn't the only driver to responsible economic policy making, and a number of factors played into it. You have also institutional reforms which reduce the discretion of policymakers on the executive branch. This has to do with Congress is playing an increasingly important role. They've lost some of their discretionary prerogatives, for example, in the use of medidas provisórias. You have the fact that the left succeeded with fiscal austerity. It's a very important lesson that was learned in the left, in the PT, that low inflation wins votes. Right, and so I think that was that was a big lesson that was learned during the Lula administration, which was learned from the leadership of the left as well. And voter demands, of course, also played a very important role in terms of driving low inflation policies. Right, so the interesting analytic question to ask is, okay, now that you take out those market constraints, and you no longer have the specter of the market breathing down politicians' neck, how do they respond, right? And this is what I think that what I would characterize as the challenge of abundance, right? And I think that we're already seeing this over the past couple years during the Lula's second term. First of all, you have complacency on reforms, right? Very hard for you to be able to convince politicians in Congress to be able to roll back the continued increase in current expenditure growth, be it in terms of pensions, in terms of payroll, in terms of all the other outlays, when you don't have the argument, the political argument, that you need to do these painful reforms in order to be able to stabilize the economy. Right? And so what have we seen? We've seen continued uptick in terms of expenditures as a percentage of GDP, right? Because there are strongly vested interests behind each of those expenditures. 90% of Brazilian expenditures are constitutionally mandated and fixed. And if you don't do anything, they continue to grow over time. So my answer to Alberto in terms of from taxes, as citing an ex-secretary of Treasury in Brazil, taxes are neither too high nor they're too low. They're just sufficient to cover expenditures. Right? and so the problem is that given that Brazil is doing so well economically, it's going to be very difficult for the next administration to be able to roll back the expenditure outlays obligations and therefore generate conditions for lower taxes. Right? The second repercussion is that we're seeing the government tinkering on macroeconomic policies. On fiscal policy, what we're seeing right now is administrations like, well, maybe we don't need as high a primary surplus target in order to be able to keep the debt per GDP ratio continue to drop. And so you see the government commitment to their fiscal targets diminishing. And the fact that they lowered their fiscal target last year during the downturn with countercyclical fiscal policy, investors reacted so positively because the fiscal problems in Brazil pale in comparison to what else is going on in the rest of the world, right? Then I think that the commitment for the fiscal austerity is diminishing. On the exchange rate, the big problem is, a stronger currency and what this does with exporters. And the government levied a 2% financial transaction tax on foreign equity and fixed income inflows, in other words, a little bit more intervention on the exchange rate, also went over relatively well, and the government's trying to figure out what can they do to stop the strengthening of the currency. On monetary policy, we haven't had that much tinkering, and the fact that Enrique Mireles has stayed at the central bank through the end of his terms help, but there is a debate within government, well, you know, that within the Lula administration is that, well, yes, Mireles has done a fantastic job, but do we really need to be held hostage to such orthodox central bank directors? And maybe we can put someone in the central bank that is not as conservative as it was during Lula's first term. So in other words, I think that precisely because Brazil is doing so well, the mix of macroeconomic policies is at play. Yes, it is. More importantly, industrial policy is back with a vengeance. Essentially, you know, when you have the Brazilian government finally having money to invest, not only have you seen the government spending more money on investments, but they've also aggressively used federal financial institutions to conduct industrial policy, and also to strengthen state-owned enterprises in heavily regulated sectors of the economy. Here's some data from Brazil's National Development Bank in terms of, you know, approvals, which is the bar on the right, and disbursements, which the BNDES extends, and you have you know, an increase from around 43 billion reais of disbursements in 2004 to close to 100 and, you know, over about 140, close to 150 billion reais in disbursements in 2009. That is a huge increase in the disbursements of credit. And behind this is a policy where policymakers are trying to create Brazilian national champions, be it in terms of the cellulosic industry, be it in telecommunications with the creation of Oi, or meatpacking, you know, and also financing federally owned, state-owned enterprises. You know, and Petrobras, of course, being the biggest recipient of credit from the BNDES, to the extent that the government, you know, as Brazil discovered 50 to 70 billion barrels of oil, they have a proposal right now in Congress to significantly lower competition and have Petrobras assume all new exploration and production activity. And a lot of the funding will come from the BNDES, right? So in other words, what really is at stake in this election is how will the next administration manage its newfound abundance? How will this impact, you know, how much politicians are willing to tinker on macroeconomic policy? And more importantly, how will industrial policy be conducted, not only through the BNDES, but also how will state-owned enterprises be managed? And that is going to have increasingly macroeconomic repercussions in terms of from the growth perspective. So my answer to Wall Street investors is, yes, there is a lot at stake in this election, particularly if you're an equity investor investing in companies, because you have an increasingly active state in heavily regulated sectors of the economy, and also the mix of macroeconomic policies is at stake. Now, 2010 election, just a quick, at least quick point. You know, I think that my own point of view, you know, I think that in line with some of the arguments that were laid out in the previous panel is that Dilma Rousseff should be considered favored to win this election. Certainly, this is far from a done deal. You know, this is you know, we aren't you know, this Serra can take it, but I think that there's too much of an excessive focus on the figure of Lula, even though he is you know, critically important, of course. And part of this reason I think that is that there's a tendency to over-personalize his own charisma. Right? Look at, I think here it's important to highlight, look at Lula's personal approval ratings throughout his 2 terms in office. Started at close to 80, and we're back up even above in the beginning of his term. You know, we have, you know, just this term right here around 2005, that was around the Mensalão, the vote buying scandal. So a lot of analysts kind of attributed the drop in approval ratings to the corruption scandal. But in fact, that did correlate with the economic cycle in Brazil, right? And if we look at you know, this is the Fundação Getúlio Vargas' data on the middle class, which also Cliff, you know, highlighted in his presentation. But the significant growth in the C class occurred precisely, you know, after 2004, 2005, right? And the drop in the E and D classes. In other words, that Lula's, you know, record high approval ratings is driven by an economic revolution, which is going on in Brazil, which really underpins all the data that we saw in the previous panel. And so this is a tough environment for an opposition candidate to operate within. Now, looking at what can we expect from Congress, right? And then I'll go into, you know, as to feed in terms of the post-election scenarios. I do think that one of the interesting electoral trends and legislative trends over the past, you know, 5 or 6 election cycles is the consistent growth of the left. This is in the lower house of Congress. And what I did is essentially, you can talk about the PSDB as being part of the left, but if you sum all of the leftist parties, the PT, the PDT, the PSB, PPS, we're asked during the Cardoso administration that the left represented, a tad over 22% of the seats in the lower house of Congress. In 2006, they elected 38% of the seats of the lower house of Congress. Right? And what did we see in the municipal elections, also in the 2008, and also just more look at more local governments? What we've seen is that all of these leftist parties have made significant inroads at the gubernatorial level in the Northeast and at the municipal level in the Northeast. Right? And usually what happens is that once you conquer the governorship and also you have the mayoral posts, that creates the backbone for you to be able to elect federal deputies in the next electoral cycle. And so what I expect to occur is that this trend will continue to grow. Right? And so the left, will probably have, a tad under 50% of the seats of the lower house of Congress. The opposition, which has a greater share of seats in the Senate, and that's really where the government has a lot of problems with the opposition, they're very vulnerable. Why? Because the Senate has 6-year terms, and a lot of the opposition senators from the Democrats or from the PSDB were elected in the Northeast, and they're coming up for very difficult re-election cycles. So both the PSDB and the Democrats are poised to have setbacks in the Senate. Right? And more importantly, that if Dilma wins this election, what I hear from some leadership from the PSDB is that they may very well lose anywhere from 20 to 25% of the federal deputies after the election because they'll switch parties to centrist parties aligned with the government. Why? Because it's very hard for you to be able to stay in the opposition for 12 years and not have access to federal credit, particularly in a context where the government has more money to throw around. Right? And so, in other words, the political environment here, and I think that this will explain a little bit of the election dynamics, is that the opposition is coming to the conclusion that they really have to win this election. Because if they don't, they're in big trouble. And they're going to lose a lot of their seats in the lower house. So when you have Fernando Henrique Cardoso making impassioned claims on the importance of this election, and trying to go a little bit more negative, there's some political undertones to here, which is that the opposition is scared of losing this election. Right? And that's why they're starting to accuse the PT of saying that if the PT wins, that Brazil will go towards the model of the PRI in Mexico, a monolithic political system with no political contestation, right? And making these kind of authoritarian claims with regard to what would happen if Dilma were to win. Right? But I think that this is an interesting component here. But the other subtext here, which is interesting, is that the left is changing. Right? Whereas in the past, the left was elected, most of their federal deputies from the Southeast and the South, and kind of heavily industrialized regions, they represented the organized labor of the electorate. Increasingly, they're capturing the unorganized or the informal economy in the North and Northeast, which is where Lula's base of support and where Bolsa Familia has had more of an impact, and all of the expansion of consumer credit has also benefited significantly. Right? So it'll be a more moderate left, but a larger left. Right? Now, what does this mean? Okay, so what does all this mean in terms of from a post-election scenario? All right. When looking at macroeconomic policymaking, I think that that even though we are in an environment where there probably is a lot at stake, I actually think that some of the concerns that are popping up in Rio and São Paulo, both with regard to Serra and with regard to Dilma, are a little bit overplayed. With regard to the Rousseff administration, I think that one thing that from an investor point of view you have to keep an eye on. Who are the individuals that Dilma is starting to pay attention to, and who compose the inner circle of her campaign. Now, what's interesting is that almost all of those have pretty pragmatic views when it comes to economic policy making, and not only represent a continuity with regard to the current administration, but may represent some marginal upside. Her inner circle of campaign includes ex-Minister of Finance Antonio Palocci, who was the market darling during Lula's first term. He is probably one of the top 3 or 4 most influential advisors within her presidential campaign. You have the ex-mayor from Belo Horizonte, Fernando Pimentel, who also was who has a reputation for being pretty conservative, or at least having a good head, on his shoulders with regard to fiscal policy. He was a potential candidate to replace Palocci when Palocci was, left the Ministry of Finance, and actually investors were rooting for him to be the Minister of Finance instead of the current Minister of Finance, Guido Mantega. I think that the strong man within her administration will most likely be the president of the BNDES, Luciano Coutinho. Now, Luciano Coutinho, certainly is of a view that is kind of more of a developmentalist view in terms of economic policy making, and also has been a critic of monetary policy making. But when it comes to fiscal policy, he certainly has a clear appraisal that you have to at least lower the pace of current expenditures on the fiscal side to generate conditions for lower real interest rates. Another individual that is close to Dilma is Nelson Barbosa, the Secretary of Political Economy from the Ministry of Finance. And also, what he'll make very clear, and some of these advisors close to Dilma, is that the next administration has to do a pension reform. Wow. So for a candidate that is supposedly much more leftist, and the problem will lead to a more irresponsible fiscal policy, you have all of the main advisors around her having a clear consensus that actually the problem and the impediment for lower real interest rates is fiscal policy. All right? Now, the problem with Dilma, however, is going to be you may have an economic team that is more conservative, all right, and main advisors, but the problem will be to carry that agenda forward, because it's going to be very difficult, not only in the context of higher growth to be able to do the types of reforms that are necessary, but also because she has Lula's inheritance. And on fiscal policy, it's not a good one, because you essentially have certain policies that were enacted during the Lula administration which are very difficult to sustain over the medium and long term. For example, what the Lula administration did was to promise that the national minimum wage, which is the minimum floor to establish pension benefits, has to be readjusted according to inflation of the previous year and GDP growth of the 2 years prior. So in other words, national minimum wage has, in a context where the economy is growing at 2.5%, 3%, that's not a tremendous problem, because then the real increases of the minimum wage, which pressure pension benefits, will be lower than they have been historically. But in a context where the economy is growing 5-6% a year, that becomes more of a problem when you index pension benefits to GDP growth, right? And so what essentially the next administration may have to undo that promise. It's going to be very difficult for Dilma to be able to undo a promise that was enacted during a Lula administration, all right? With regard to exchange rate and monetary policy, I actually think that maybe the risks of changes in a recessive administration are larger, or being underappreciated in markets in comparison to fiscal policy. In fiscal policy, my message is a little bit more favorable. But here I think that if Dilma wins, I think that she may be tempted. I'm not betting on this, but I do think that there is a possibility, at least for her to consider, a little bit more dovish central bank director. When it comes to José Serra, I'll finish up soon. When it comes to José Serra, I think that the message is a little bit different. Here, I think that investors are correct in the assumption that Serra will toe a tighter line on fiscal policy, in part because he doesn't have to deal with some of the problems of undoing promises from the Lula administration. And some of the things that you do on fiscal policy, you don't need to do a constitutional reform. But the point is that Serra will not be able to do any measures on fiscal policy that need a constitutional reform in Congress, precisely because of the trend line I highlighted in the previous graph in terms of the growth of the left. Right? Whereas Cardoso was able to manage a overarching majority and run over the left, at least the organized left, I don't think that Serra would be able to do so if he were to win the presidency. On an exchange rate, but the big concern from a market perspective for Serra would be the fact that he has been such a critic of the central bank and also a critic of a stronger currency. I think that the risks of intervention on the currency are larger than intervention on monetary policy. I do believe that the economic advisors around Serra also hold to the conviction that you need to generate tighter fiscal policy to generate conditions for lower real interest rates. In other words, what we're talking about here are not really big changes, in terms of the parameters of the current macroeconomic policy, but it's precisely the mix of fiscal and monetary policy making that can have an impact on whether real interest rates in Brazil will drop. And here I think that on average, things will be a little bit better than investors expect for Rousseff, but she's going to have politically a more difficult time doing the things necessary to implement it. And Serra, I think, will be contributive to a higher growth environment given the tighter stance on fiscal policy. But the big difference, I think, here between the two candidates will be on sectoral policy and industrial policy and the role of state-owned enterprises. And I think that the big elephant in the room is oil and gas. How will Brazil develop nearly 50 to 70 billion barrels of oil that it discovered? It could be a game changer from a macroeconomic perspective and an investment cycle. Right? And here I think that if Dilma wins, she will carry out and implement the reform that Lula sent to Congress, which is essentially saying that we're going to drastically reduce competition. We're not going to allow international oil companies to come in and be lead operator to develop these new reserves. They can be junior partners, but with fairly strict terms. And Petrobras is going to do it all, right? I mean, essentially, with partnership. And I think this is a recipe for a slower pace of production, less revenue generation, and Petrobras, potentially running into cost overruns problems. I mean, this is a tremendous task for one company to take on its own. Serra, however, I think would take a very different task. I think that Serra's preference order is to generate revenue, more so than strengthen state-owned enterprises. And so what do you think Serra will do? I think he will scrap whatever reform Congress is about to approve, and essentially conduct competitive bid rounds and say who can pay the higher signing bonus will take the rights to develop a lot of these reserves while protecting some reserve rights for Petrobras to maintain somewhat of a privileged position. Right? In other words, more revenue, right, that can actually untie some of the fiscal burden and more room to potentially lower taxes. Right? Utilities, same type of dimension in terms of the big decision is, are you going to strengthen Eletrobras or not? Dilma clearly is going down the path of wanting to strengthen Eletrobras to be a main investor next to private investors. Again, this is a more regular, there aren't as many policy issues to deal with, but one of the big ones is how are you going to renew 20% of the country's power generation park that is going to expire in 2015. Without getting into the details, is there a way that you can do this to privilege Eletrobras or not? Dilma certainly would privilege Eletrobras, whereas Serra, I think, is an open question. Telecommunications. The government is preparing a national plan for broadband infrastructure and in which they want to revive, at least the government looks like it wants to revive, the defunct state-owned enterprise Telebras, right, in order to be able to manage a national backbone for broadband. Right? Now here I think the press is being a little bit sensationalist with regard to Dilma, because if you speak to her advisors in government, actually the driver of this reform to bring back a defunct state-owned enterprise is actually to increase more competition within the industry. There is an appraisal within the administration that you have an oligopolistic private sector which does not have a market interest in expanding broadband services because it'll eat into their landline services. And so I think that here there's a mixture of pragmatism but also a view of statism, whereas Serra I think would have a heavier role for the private sector. Mining, another proposal for mining code. Are they going to introduce more intervention or not? Interestingly enough, transport infrastructure, I think we're going to have pragmatism on both. Both Serra and Dilma are going to actively court the private sector in terms of concessions for ports, airport infrastructure, roads, and federal highways, essentially because you have the big push because of the Olympics and the World Cup. In other words, there are very important differences between these two, but I also think it's important to highlight that some of the hyperbole around Dilma in terms of how statist she will be is somewhat exaggerated. Right? So, in sum, I think that, this is kind of, just want to conclude here. So what does this mean in terms of from a reform outlook in Congress, right? I think that, when looking at the reform outlook for a Rousseff administration, I think that she's going to have an overarching majority, yes, but the big challenge will be how to manage the relationship between the PT and the PMDB that are going to be the two large coalition partners. We're already seeing this in even the decision to nominate the vice presidential candidate where Lula wanted Henrique Meirelles and the PT balked. Right? It also means that probably the agenda will be more microeconomic in focus rather than macroeconomic in focus. And I think that one of the main focuses of the next administration will also be on the microeconomic reform agenda to overcome the hurdles to investments. That is a huge problem. How can you actually get money out the door and execute it, given all of these tremendous deficiencies on the infrastructure side? Right? Anything on fiscal is going to be piecemeal and not constitutional. Serra, he's going to have a smaller majority, but potentially less tension within that coalition. But the left is going to have a veto over any constitutional reforms that he may enact. I think that the only big reform that I can see in a Serra administration is tax reform. This is, that one of the main political hurdles to tax reform in Brazil has always been how can you reconcile the revenue demands of state governments and the federal government and between state governments. Now, there's tremendous skepticism in Brazil that any administration could do tax reform, but I'm actually a little bit more confident, or at least optimistic about this, because the macroeconomics plays an important role. If you're in an environment of relative abundance on fiscal policy, it's easier to compensate states that feel that they're going to lose with a tax reform. So in other words, it's much more difficult to do a tax reform when you're in tight macroeconomic constraints than when you are under the current environment. So it is possible, although extremely challenging. But I do think that the Serra administration will probably push for a tax reform more so than any other, but also a refound push on macroeconomic reform. In other words, nothing to be tremendously scared about in this election, either from Serra or from Dilma, but at least from a political risk perspective, certainly a lot of reason for us to follow it, and given its potential impact on economic policy making. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very much. João, do you have a PowerPoint?
No.
You can speak from there or from the podium. Where are you?
I don't want to keep records of what I say. It's entering the domain of futurology here. Thank you for the invitation, Paulo. It's a pleasure to be here, speaking at the Wilson Center. I'm going to talk about foreign policy outlook, following a little bit of what Garmin said on what's the impact of political coalitions in Congress on most of the domestic drivers of Brazilian foreign policy. I'd like to begin by asking, by considering, does it matter? Does foreign policy matter as when we talk about public opinion in elections in Brazil? Traditionally, not much. But according to the latest Ibope poll from March 2010, most remembered news were related to foreign policy. 12% said that the most remembered news in the past month was Lula's trip to Haiti, 12%. Also 12% Lula's trips abroad in general. 7% Lula's trip to Cuba. 6% Hillary Clinton's visit to Brasilia. And finally, 5% Lula's comment on Iranian nuclear program. So these were the 5 most remembered news in Brazil in March, according to the Ibope poll. The first, just to get an idea, the first non-international issue, or the first domestic issue, was Dilma Rousseff's confirmation as PT presidential candidate with 4% only. So it doesn't matter much, but there's a growing importance of foreign policy today in Brazilian politics, in Brazilian political life. More coverage by the domestic and international press. I mean, the past month there has been a lot of pieces on not only in Brazilian press but also in international press on Brazil's foreign policy stance. For example, on the 29th of March, there was this the report of the Wall Street Journal report on Brazil. The Times ran a piece on the 20th of March on Lula's the possibility of Lula becoming UN Secretary General, quoting Lula as being infected by the peace virus. So there's been a lot of fuss on Brazil's stance in the world of late. And also, how can we answer the following question? What are the reasons behind this newfound interest in Brazilian foreign policy? First, of course, there are more, on one hand, recent controversial issues, such as Brazil's relation with Iran, meddling with Middle East affairs, and Cuba. Brazil's president was in Cuba when the political dissident died in prison of a hunger strike. Also, Brazil's increasing role in the multilateral groups, in WTO, the retaliation against the U.S. and cotton subsidies lately, and Brazil's role in the G20, the financial G20, and also in the United Nations Security Council. These are more recent controversial issues that help put Brazil on the map or on the radar. But then, on the other hand, there are several structural changes that also matter because historically the Ministry of Foreign Relations in Brazil, Itamaraty, defined or controlled foreign policy agenda in Brazil traditionally, historically. A situation that many have said that has maintained relatively stable since the new democratic period, since 1985. For 2 main reasons. Basically, the first one is that foreign policy issues and international relations has almost no political or electoral impact in Brazilian daily life or daily politics and elections. And the second reason is that there are few experts on foreign policy and international relations outside Itamaraty or outside the government. The academia or even Brazil's economy is relatively closed. I believe only 15% of Brazil's GDP is related trade, export and import. It's only accounts to 15%, less than 20% of Brazil's GDP. So companies don't have that much interest on Brazil's international negotiations in general and trade negotiations in particular. But I believe that situation has changed in the past few years. First reason, and structural reasons, is the strengthening of Brazilian democracy since 1985, and especially since 1988, when the new constitution was promulgated. And that led to increasing public debate on policy planning, mostly on social policies. More accountability. These policies, social policies mainly, are held more accountable today. And I believe the last policy to feel that pressure of public demand and public debate is foreign policy. I'm not saying that it's going to be as accountable as other social policies, such as health policies and education policies, but there are a few areas of foreign policy, mainly in trade areas, that are more accountable or more prone to influence today than they were years ago. The second reason for this structural change and why foreign policy has become more popular in Brazil or more politically important, relevant in Brazil, is the economic liberalization since the 1990s, the end of the GATT rounds, the Uruguay round, that opened lowered general industrial tariffs. Also the creation of Mercosul in 91, 95, and the whole round of privatizations by the Cardoso government, and even before that by Itamar Franco's government, that has led to a rising distributive conflicts as an effect of foreign and trade policies on Brazil's industrial sector, on many lobbying groups, pressure groups such as Fiesp, and two examples that to underline the importance of this is the impact of the Bolivian natural gas crisis on Brazilian politics in 2005 or 6, I believe, and also our growing trade relations with China and the importance of that matter. And finally, the third reason for this growing interest in Brazil's foreign policy is President Lula's more assertive or confident foreign policy rhetoric. That has been known that Brazil's foreign policy has been more ambitious, many more goals since in 2003, and that has led initially to a dangerous combination of more goals with the same budget. In Lula's first term, the list of goals of Brazil's foreign policy, including trade policy, including opening up embassies all over the world, mainly in Africa and Asia, and also Haiti, Brazil's command and the mission, UN mission in Haiti. That widening of Brazil's foreign policy agenda was not accompanied by an increase in budget. I'm talking about the foreign ministry, and I'm talking about the defense ministry. This is in the first term. That situation has changed in the second term. More money going to both ministries. Just as an example, Brazil had large, significant debts with UN agencies 2 or 3 years ago. As a result, there has been an increase in foreign policy's impact on domestic politics, as I said before, and the new president, be it Serra or Dilma or Lula, as I gather from here, the new president will have to deal with several new domestic drivers of Brazilian foreign policy, and 3 main drivers that I identify as relevant. First, Brazilian Congress role. Initially, Congress had a very discrete role in Mercosul, for example. On our Constitution, actually, Article 4th of our Constitution says that Brazil should implement social, cultural, political, and economic integration with Latin American countries. So that, some might say, interpret that, including myself, that's kind of like a blank check to the executive to reach any kind of agreements south of Rio Grande. And, for example, so meaning that while Mercosur negotiations are going on in Congress, before the approximation of Brazil and Argentina in the 80s, we did not see too much congressional interference, only sectoral interference on matters such as automobiles, dairy products, sugar. But in general, there was somewhat of a consensus between the legislative branch and the executive branch on Brazilian foreign policy to the region, mainly to Argentina and to Mercosur, with Paraguay and Uruguay. So Congress's role was initially discreet on Mercosur and became more noticeable on Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, on FTAA, because then you put a country to the north of Rio Grande in the game, and Brazil's Congress began to show more interest on Brazil's trade policies. There were a lot of proposals of referendum against FTAA. So you had a result on the name of the referendum that actually proposed in Congress, saying that we should have a referendum against the FTAA. Quite curious. And also a lot of propositions on to implement a TPA, a Trade Promotion Authority model in Brazil's Congress, to try to give Congress the authority of authorizing or not the president to seek these agreements outside the region. And also Congress has become more aggressive on issues such as trade with China and the Bolivian gas issue, and also the Venezuela's admission to Mercosur. Much of this has to do, of course, with the general government opposition battle, and also with pressure groups, increasing influence on congressional activities, pressure groups such as Fiesp and agricultural pressure groups that work along with political parties to try to gain more influence on foreign policy. Just an example of this new role of Congress' role in foreign policy making. Yesterday there was this big and heated debate on Brazilian Senate between Celso Amorim, the Foreign Ministry, and also Tasso Gereissati, senator from PSDB. On Celso Amorim basically said that I hope my candidate wins, his candidate being Dilma Rousseff, because he is affiliated recently to PT. So that gave a little unheard of discussion on foreign policy, heated foreign policy on Brazilian elections. The second driver, political parties, the second domestic driver of Brazilian foreign policy, PT's left-wing and south-south foreign policy was faced with criticism from PSDB and PFL, or the opposition. These parties, however, they lack a clear foreign policy message. They criticize PT's foreign policy or ideological rhetoric or the priorities with India, with poor or developing countries, but that does not mean that they stand for they don't have a free trade agenda. You cannot say that PSDB is a pro-free trade party. So they criticize, but they don't give a clear message on what's the alternative. But also on that note, of the importance of political parties, PT recently had an idea to create a foreign policy council in Brazil to try, for two reasons that I interpret. One, to try to curb Itamaraty's influence on foreign policy, and the second one is to try to maintain Lula's legacy after he's gone, or not, from the administration. But that's actually, I believe that there's no chance, or slight chance, of this council coming to be, but still it shows that all political parties are beginning to become more interest in foreign policy. And the third and final domestic driver is the executive branch agencies. More agencies are involved in the decision-making process, kind of like the bureaucratic politics model that not only Itamaraty deals with foreign policy, but also the Ministry of Trade and Development, and also agricultural ministries and specific issues ministries such as science and technology, environment, and the list goes on. So you have also an example of the Defense Ministry in Brazil had an important document 2 years ago on Brazilians' defense strategy. This document had no participation of a diplomat on its writing whatsoever, and it mentioned foreign policy issues such as Brazil's resistance to ratify the additional protocol to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So you have this major document, strategic document of Brazilian government that had no participation of Itamaraty beforehand. They entered afterwards, but there was a lot of debate on that issue. So How has President Lula dealt with these domestic drivers? First, his charisma that was mentioned here, leadership and popularity, has shielded his foreign policy options from domestic and international criticisms. Lula has no problem talking to Obama one day and having a photo op with Ahmadinejad the next day. Lula uses some of his foreign policy actions to satisfy his own political party, the PT. Marco Aurelio Garcia, who's one of the political leaders of PT, has a prominent role in Brazil's foreign policy today. Also, Samuel Pinheiro Guimarães was also very praised by PT before because he was the main person against FTAA negotiations back in the 90s. And finally, Celso Amorim's affiliation to PT recently and his candidate, Dilma Rousseff. The South-South rhetoric is also very welcomed by PT, and a mild anti-American stance on a few issues, and the ideas such as the creation of a foreign policy council. So that's one way that Lula contains his own party stance on foreign policy. And but there's also one interesting fact that also Garman mentioned, that's governing coalition. Lula has a broad and diverse governing coalition, and he has forged the largest cabinet ever in Brazil's history. Just to have an idea, Sarney had 32 ministers. Collor had 29, Itamar 29, Fernando Henrique Cardoso 33, and Lula 39. Some might say 40, but it's quite large. As a result, on foreign policy issues, as on other policies, as a matter of fact, President Lula's administration has worked like a divisive cabinet, an excess of opinions from economic and trade policies to defense matters. On environmental and climate change debate, for example, you had, if you watched Brazil's Global News, the news channel in Brazil, you could watch two ministers fighting live on TV. One defending that Brazil should be more progressive on climate change targets, and the other one saying that no, we shouldn't. So you had that live on TV, and you can project that division into many issues, including economic policies before Antonio Palocci and against José Dirceu and so on. So that excess of opinion has been one main characteristic of Lula's administration. But an important note is that Lula's charisma and also his labor union experience helped him deal with that kind of diversity, because his labor union experience is somewhat to handle with that every day, with people saying different things, and basically at the end you decide what's going to be better for the whole organization. So Lula floats above all these different opinions, and he picks the one that fits best at the right moment, at the right time. The example being climate change negotiations again. He chose Dilma Rousseff to head the delegation in Copenhagen, and she was well known to be anti-environment before. She had many disputes with Marina Silva, who was the environmental minister before, and Dilma was energy ministry, for example. So Lula, and I saw many of the speeches of all the ministries in Brazil dealing with the climate change issue, and you had 3 or 4 different positions, basically. And at the end, Brazil, Dilma, she took the nice role of trying to be more pro-environment, and had succeeded, actually, in Copenhagen, despite there being no treaty in Copenhagen. How will Dilma Rousseff and José Serra deal with these domestic drivers of Brazil's foreign policy? Well, there's one certainty that I will mention, that either one will start off their administration with much lower popularity levels and less charisma than Lula's. And that might have an impact on Brazil's foreign policy through several ways. First, Dilma. Dilma will certainly try to follow Lula's footsteps on general foreign policy goals, and she's likely to have a broad or broader coalition to deal with, as Garman mentioned. He mentioned that the left is growing. It is, but PT is not. PT is the 2002-06 election cycle. PT actually had less deputies elected. So that means that she'll have to deal with a broad or even broader coalition than Lula had to deal. That means that with less charisma and leadership, she'll probably maintain a large cabinet to satisfy her political allies, meaning that a multitude of voices of foreign policy, however, could bring turbulence to Dilma's administration's decision-making process. She seems to lack Lula's experience in dealing with different opinions. That has been said by many former colleagues of her, that maybe she doesn't have a lot of experience dealing with different opinions. She may also be more prone to criticism inside and outside Brazil. Finally, she might experience more pressure from her own party, as Lula did, but was able to fend off this PT's pressure with his, again, charisma, popularity, and Teflon skin. These are all ingredients for a riskier and possibly frustrated foreign policy. It will be hard to maintain Lula's international legacy. And Dilma may benefit from a possible future international role for Lula. There's been said that he could become World Bank president or UN Secretary General, etc. Serra is likely to have a smaller cabinet, smaller coalition, and less divergent voices on many issues, including foreign policy. He will be forced from the beginning to send a clear message on issues such as trade relations with countries like Iran, Venezuela, and other authoritarian regimes. So far, his party, PSDB, hasn't done much but criticize. A few names apparently identified with Serra's campaign team suggest a foreign policy closer to that of Cardoso's government, more mainstream. But that's also unlikely to happen because Brazil's regional and global importance rose significantly, mainly due to its economic performance. Brazil's role in international institutions, the WTO, the G20, BRICS, and so on, cannot simply be undone. No retreat is possible without considerable costs. Serra's challenge will be to find a more sober and less ideological foreign policy without seeming to be less ambitious. On the specific issues, and I just list 4 specific issues, on regional integration, just to finish, on regional integration, the main question is about the future of Mercosur as a customs union. There have been talks on Serra's camp on a possible step back, turning Mercosur into a free trade area and freeing its members to seek bilateral trade agreements with other countries. But since there's no clear free trade agenda on either candidate's platforms, it's unlikely that fundamental changes with Mercosur will happen. With Dilma, more of the same, but with Serra, more pressure on Argentina to try to solve trade disputes. On the political front, Serra is expected to adopt more neutral stance between left and right divide in the continent, less vocal than Lula, and a more business-oriented approach. Again, maintain the core of Lula's agenda without the ideological rhetoric. I'm not saying that Lula is not business-oriented, but just basically with much of the same but less ideological rhetoric. And both candidates, I believe, will likely favor state enterprises, Petrobras, Eletrobras, BNDES, as tools of Brazilian foreign policy in the region. Trade. Despite PSDB's criticisms of Lula's foreign trade policy, the party lacks a clear alternative message on trade negotiations, as I said before. Bilateral negotiations with the US, the EU, Doha Round, deals with other emerging countries. PSDB, as I mentioned, is not a free trade party. One matter that will have to be addressed is the increasing competition with China in other markets, mainly in the United States and also in Latin America. For example, Brazil has large trade surpluses with every South American neighbor. A situation that may have to change in the near future if Brazil wants to deepen regional integration and gain more access to markets and also increase Brazilian foreign direct investment in these countries. We have surpluses with every South American neighbor since the 1990s, with Argentina was the only one exception in the 90s. Also, in Serra's camp, there's talk of a possible Brazilian USTR, something of a CAMEX with teeth, to try to distance trade and politics and ideology. I don't believe that will happen because CAMEX had an important role now recently with the retaliations against the United States on cotton subsidies. So, but still, that talk is being kept on in the media. Coalition with the emerging powers. That's a safer bet, I believe. Groupings such as BRICS, BASIC, and IBSA. For those who don't know, BASIC is the Brazil, South Africa, India, and China on climate change. BRICS, you all know. IBSA is India, Brazil, South Africa. These groups will likely remain in Brazil's foreign policy agenda, whoever wins the elections. Through these groups, Brazil will address major global issues, I believe, like reform of multilateral institutions, and climate change, among other things. There are limitations, however. No clear common denominator on many issues on these groups, and that will keep alive the search for a tentative agenda, and that will, I believe that will be tantalizing. So basically never find one issue that will bring together all these different emerging powers. And finally, Brazil-U.S. relations, a history of permanent frustration and unmet expectations. What does Brazil want? Does Brazil want a trade agreement? No, not really. Just lower tariffs and lower subsidies, as we've seen. Arms purchase? Not really. But it's important to note that of the major emerging powers, and I'm mentioning here India, China, Russia, and even Japan and Germany, Brazil is the only that has no major treaty, defense, security, trade, or special bilateral relationship with the United States. India has a recent nuclear treaty with the United States. China and the G2 talks with the United States on finance, climate change. Russia has its defense and security dialogue with the United States on issues such as NATO expansion, missile defense, disarmament. Japan and Germany are traditional allies of the United States. Brazil has no clear major treaty with the United States. There's been talk of a defense treaty recently between Brazil and the United States, but nothing clear yet. Biofuels and energy cooperation could become the core issues of a bilateral agenda. Yes, they could, but there are a lot of issues differences between Brazil production of ethanol and the United States, etc. And finally, what does Brazil want from the United States? So far that I can observe is Brazil wants the United States recognition of Brazil's role as a major power and major partner, not only on regional issues, but also on global affairs as well. Basically, that's it. I have another few issues here, but I think my time is up.
João.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from Cláudio Couto that will present a little bit on the political context, but will also react to previous two speakers.
Good afternoon already. Good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me to be here, Paulo. There is something that I was thinking about to talk today, but I believe that the people who came before me, they already spoke about this, something like this, for example, how the population evaluates Lula's administration, and if we want to make a comparison between Lula's administration and Lula himself, we can see that we have a difference between them, but I don't know that is too much interesting at this time, and since I don't have too much time, we'll already talk a lot about this. But there are other information that I believe that's somewhat interesting to think about. And I believe there's something in the background of the Brazilian presidential elections that is important to understand why, actually, in my opinion, Dilma is so favorite today, despite the fact that Serra appears in the front in the polls. And it has to do what we can say is the current Brazilian mood. And it has to do with what I call here this overcoming of the underdog complex. Just to explain what is this, the idea of underdogs complex is an idea that was framed by a Brazilian literate, Nelson Rodrigues, sorry. And Nelson Rodrigues said the Brazilians had a perception about themselves that they were underdogs, that they don't worth too much, that they are not capable of doing a lot of things. But I believe that there was a change about this recently. And if we take into consideration this data concerning September 1998, when Cardoso was re-elected in the first round, and January 2010, with the situation that we have already seen before with the other presentators, what we can see is that when we take into consideration, for example, the pride of being a Brazilian today, it has increased twice compared to that time. That is, if you ask for a citizen, would you say that our feeling of being proud to be Brazilian has increased, decreased, or remained the same? Then 53% of people today say that they are proud of being Brazilian. It has increased comparable to the recent period. And if you take into consideration the satisfaction with the country, we have an even more impressive data. It increased 3 times compared to the situation that we used to have in 1998. The satisfaction with the country today is 48%. It used to be 15%. And believe that such a kind of situation is important to understand this new perception of Brazilians with themselves. Of course, it has to do with this switch of a lot of people from the down the lower classes to the middle classes, but it has to do also with the recovery of the employment rates, with the richness of the country and many other things. And when we take into consideration the trust in institutions, we have another indicator of this. And please pay attention for one of the information here at least. The information concerning the government increase of trust from September 1998 to January 10. We can see that the increment in the trust in the government means the union, the federal administration, it increased 21.8%. It's the first on the rank of increasing. But government, on the other hand, it was in September 1998 something like the sixth in the rank here, and today it's the third in the rank here in concerning the institutions in which people trust. And it has to do, of course, again, with the recent administration, with Lula's administration, I believe. And since people believe more in the federal government than they used to believe before. But since Paulo asked me to talk about the probability or the likelihood of political coalitions in the next 2 administrations, I believe that it's better to go to this instead of repeating a lot of things that you have heard today. And what we have here, I don't know if it's very clear to see. Is it possible to see the numbers? Yeah. What we have here, we have all the parties that have seats on the Brazilian Congress. As we can see, we have a very peculiar setting in Brazilian political party system. We have 20 parties in the Congress today. None of these parties has more than 19% of the seats on the lower house, and no more than 26% on the Senate, in the case of the PMDB. And it poses, of course, a problem for every government when this government is trying to implement its agenda and trying to build sufficient, enough coalitions to support this agenda. The problem is that you have to make coalitions of at least 4 or 5 parties if you want to have the 50% plus 1 of the votes in both chambers. But there is another problem concerning Brazilian political agenda or the policy agenda of every administration. This problem has to do with the fact that in Brazil it's not enough to pass laws that can be approved with the 50% plus 1, or ordinary laws, as we call them. It's necessary to amend the constitution in Brazil if you want to implement your policy agenda. And why this? Because the Brazilian constitution has a peculiarity. The Brazilian constitution contains inside itself many public policies, ordinary policies that different administrations will try to implement differently. Just to give you, I think that is a clear example of this. The Constitution defines that the budget for education must be 25% of the total amount of revenues. That is, it doesn't matter the government. In the state and municipal level, they have to expend 25%. And in the federal level, they have to expend 18%. We have many other examples of this. This is just one to give you an understanding what I call public policies. And we can say that this is a good public policy. It doesn't matter if it's good or not. What matters is that different administrations would have different perceptions of this and would try to do it differently. And so different administrations have to change the constitution. But to change the constitution, it's necessary to have more than 50% plus 1. It's necessary to have 60% of the votes in both chambers twice. And so the administration has to build a coalition of at least 60% of the seats. And they do this. They try to build coalitions of 70%, 75%. because it's the number of votes necessary not only to pass constitutional amendments and, of course, all the other law, all the statutes, but it's the number necessary to pass the agenda, considering that the parties are not totally disciplined. We have a very high discipline in Brazil. The parties in general vote united in 90% of the situations, or 90% of the members of the parties, both in Senate and the chamber. They vote in favor of what their leaders tell them to do. But despite this, it's necessary to have this margin, and so to have 70 or something percent. And so what we can see here, we can see that different administrations will have to build coalitions concerning all these parties, and to have 5, 7, or in the case of Lula's administration, 10 parties inside the coalition. And what means to build a coalition? It means to distribute positions in the government. Ministers or departments, as you prefer, and also positions in the lower ranks of the public administration in order to obtain support. I differentiate the parties here in 4 colors. And each of these colors means one thing. The red color refers to the leftist parties in general, but more than this, to the parties that in general work together when PT is in the administration. Of course, PT itself, but also the Labour Party, the PDT, the Socialist Party, the PSB, and the Communist Party, the PCdoB. These 4 parties, in general, they work as a bloc in the national administration. And if there is a government, an administration of the other side, that is, of the PSDB, or leadered by the PSDB, these parties tend to be in the opposition. It doesn't matter what occurs. On the other hand, the parties in blue here, PSDB, the Social Democrat, the Democrats, the former called Liberal Front Party, and the Popular Socialist Party, the PPS, that used to be, a long time ago, the Communist Party of Brazil, all these parties work together also. That is, if there is a government that has a president from PSDB, all these parties tend to be together, and they tend to be against a petist administration. And in yellow, we have the parties that goes with any government. It doesn't matter which. And this is the good part of the thing. There is just one that is in black here, the PSOL, that is a split from PT, the Libertarian Socialist Party, and they are against any government. This is the other situation. It doesn't matter which the government is, I will be against it. But if we take this into consideration, what are the consequences of this? I took into consideration the current distribution of seats in the Congress as a proxy to think about what can be the next Congress. Why this? Because it's impossible to define now what will be the composition of the Congress. And I believe that we won't have a very different distribution of seats in the next election. We can be something more for the left, depending on the development, on the performance of Dilma during the election, or we can have something more to the center-right with for the blues if Serra wins the election. But I don't think that would be so different from the situation that we have today. And so I prefer for parsimony to take this into consideration as a tentative to figure out what can be the coalitions in the next elections. And what we see here, we see that these parties that are pro any government, it doesn't matter which, they have something like 46% or 43% of the seats both in House and the Senate. This is enough, together with the other blocs, to build a coalition that can pass every policy that this government is trying to implement. If we take into consideration the current situation and how the PT built its coalition, what we can see here is that we have 78% of the seats in the Senate. It's for this reason that the main difficulties that PT faced during Lula's administration were exactly in the Senate. It was in the Senate, for example, that a very important tax for the administration, the tax over financial transactions, that was a tax that was directed totally to Social Security and the health. This act, the renovation of this tax was defeated exactly in the Senate. The government won in the chamber, on the House, but they lost on the Senate. And there is in the Senate, it is exactly when they have the smaller share of the seats. So if you have both a PT government or a PSDB government, I believe that in both cases, the administration will be able to build enough coalitions to pass the largest part of their agendas. Perhaps they can be more successful in the House or in the Senate, perhaps depending on how the different parties will perform in the next elections, in the elections for the Congress. It would be a more favorable situation for a pro-PT or a pro-PSDB government, but it would be very difficult to don't have a relatively calm situation for each administration. And I believe so that the next government, independently of which will be their agendas, they will be successful in the implementation of their policies. But I think that I'll stop here and wait for questions since we don't have too much time.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudio. So we have come to the question and answer period, and our speakers are ready for, yes, Peter.
That's the first question. 2004 was part of the joint task force that received the MINUSTA, the Brazilians leading the UN force, and that was a major event in history, really, if you look about it. And talvez ajudando os pobres do Haiti, that's Lula, right? But the question I have for you, gentlemen, I think João Augusto started to talk a little bit about it, is depending on which candidate becomes the president, how do you see the Brazilian military being employed worldwide, and how do you see the defense relationship we have with Brazil changing?
Well, first, there's been recently a talk on a treaty between the United States and Brazil. I've read, I think it was yesterday or before yesterday's paper, that Minister Nelson Jobim was to talk with Secretary Gates on this. I'm not sure on the details on the matter, but wouldn't be a major defense treaty because we haven't had one, I believe, since the 1950s.
54.
54, yes. So, but it wouldn't be a major Colombia-style treaty. It would be basically just to have more cooperation on the development of technology and things like that. On the issue of Haiti, for Brazil, I believe that's actually one of the issues that I didn't mention that because of lack of time. But I believe that issue will be more important in the years to come because of Brazil's role in the MINUSTA mission, the UN mission in Haiti, and also because of Brazil's lack of experience dealing with long-term international commitments, such as Haiti, and difficult commitments. I think so far Brazil has done a magnificent job in Haiti, along with other countries, Latin American countries, and also because of the terrible earthquake, along with the United States also. But we might have a problem if, for Brazilian, not only the amount of resources that Brazil is putting into Haiti, the risk of human lives, because Brazil hasn't fought a war since the Paraguayan War in the 19th century, so we're not used to seeing our military die abroad. And that could become one political issue in the years to come if that happens, or if the situation in Haiti does not improve. And also the amount of money. Brazil is spending a lot on this mission. And finally, the matter of prestige. Brazil went to Haiti also. I wouldn't say that was the only reason to try to sustain its bid for the permanent seat on Security Council, but Brazil went also because of that. I'm not saying it's the only reason. So if Brazil was to leave the command of the mission without Haiti in a worse situation that when Brazil entered, that wouldn't be good for Brazilian foreign policy. So I think it's our smaller version of Iraq or Afghanistan, if you will.
Okay. João, thank you. Just one thing, Alberto has the floor. Just one thing, Brazil did fight in Italy, Second World War, and lost about 450 soldiers. there.
And just one quick comment. I think I think there is a link between kind of the macroeconomic story that I was talking about in terms of significantly reduced macroeconomic vulnerabilities and kind of defense strategy, to the extent that what we're seeing now in Brazil has unparalleled amounts of resources to be able to actually increase military expenditures, right? And that was only made possible when the government did not have such a tremendous pressure to meet very high fiscal targets. So I do think that military outlays and just expenditures will be on the rise, in the years to come.
Alberto.
I would like you to comment. If Serra is elected, it's more clear what's possible to do because of the size of coalition, because there is no Lula. However, if Dilma, I would like to add two things, and I would like you to think about that and to think about the consequence for a possible Dilma government. If she's elected, she'll have a larger coalition. In Brazil, it's not like a coalition theory. The more people have available, the less expensive is the coalition. In Brazil, the other way around. The more people there is available, the more expensive it is to get the coalition together, because everybody wants money from government. It's like that. No, everybody knows that. This is one thing. I'd like your comments. The second thing is that I believe that maybe during the first year, Dilma will want to get rid of Lula. Of course, Dilma, if Dilma is elected, she wants to be re-elected. To be re-elected, she needs to get rid of Lula somehow, at some extent. So she'll need PT. She's not a natural leader. It has impact in the international policy. She's not a natural leader of PT. Maybe she'll need to get closer to José Dirceu, to the president of PT at the moment. And what would be the impact of these movements, together with the size of coalition?
Well, since Alberto went there, remember that José Dirceu will be eligible in 4 years.
He's very strong at PT.
Yeah.
So, but you are predicting the great betrayal here?
It's not a betrayal. It's a logical behavior. It's a logical behavior. Yeah. Well, everybody does like that in Brazil or anywhere in the world.
Let's be on the record. Alberto said that, okay? Yes.
No.
Yeah, no, let's come here, or do you have a compliment to that, David? No, okay, another answer. Okay, go.
Yeah, no, I'll take that first, if that's all right. I mean, first of all, I actually, when it comes to Lula's role in a Rousseff administration, I completely agree. I mean, I think that there is a little bit of an over-exaggeration also in terms of how her campaign will be structured, how her government will be structured. People saying, the only reason why Antônio Palocci is in Dilma's campaign committee is because Lula put him there. Lula wanted to have Meirelles be Dilma's vice presidential candidate. Lula will ensure that her administration will have a continuity of current economy. I don't think so. I mean, I think that whenever you have a successor, it's only natural that you try to step out of the shadow of your predecessor. Of course, you have to. Otherwise, you're not going to have the conditions to be able to govern, right? So she will have to do so. I mean, I agree with that appraisal entirely. And I think that people underestimate that her campaign committee are a function of her personal relationships with those people in that committee, right? I had a meeting with the ex-president of the PT, Ricardo Berzoini, who was in that committee of Dilma's campaign. Now it's José Eduardo Dutra, the current president of the PT. And he essentially told me, he said, listen, there's a reason why Palocci is in the committee and José Dirceu is not. Dilma has a very good working relationship with Palocci and does not with José Dirceu. Right? In other words, so she is going to have to construct the ties within the PT, and I think she's already starting to do so, right? And that's natural to occur. Now, does she have the skills to be able to rely upon the PT and construct that leadership within the party and in the Congress? And that is going to be a vulnerability. I think that Dilma has a reputation and a track record in her role of chief of staff within government of not building coalitions. In fact, that her job has always been to essentially she has a very centralized structure of decision making in the chief of staff's office vis-a-vis other ministries. You know, and her relationship with congressional leaders has a track record of being horrible. You know, in speaking with party leaders in Congress, you know, that they're not within the PT. What they tell me is that they go to the chief of staff's office, and she'll reunite these party leaders, and she'll just essentially point a finger. You have to do this. You don't do that to a party leader in Congress. They got to the point where some of those party leaders say, you know, we stopped listening. We come there, but you know, now the interesting thing is that her challenges of becoming a good candidate as well. She's never run for office. She hasn't, you know, learned how to have a campaign. She'll have to have a learning curve in Congress. And those same party leaders that told me that she was humiliating party leaders in closed-door conversations in the chief of staff's office are saying that, wow, she's turning from vinegar to wine. I mean, she is, you know, she is going out. She is being very more affable. She is, you know, so I agree that that's a vulnerability, although I wouldn't necessarily discount that there is a possibility of learning here, and there is a learning curve. You know, with regard to the government coalition, you know, I think you're right. There is a higher cost. Although I guess that you know, this speaks to the difference in view that I expressed in my presentation and Claudia's presentation, which was very good. I mean, you know, in looking at this graph right here, right? I mean, what's interesting is that the opposition has given the government a lot of trouble in the Senate, right? And they have 30% of the seats in the Senate. In other words, if you have 30% of the seats, and you can count on the dissension within the pro any government bloc, right? That sometimes you can get close to above 40%, right, and stop a constitutional reform, right? The reason why I'm of the view that Serra is going to have a harder time enacting constitutional reforms from a pure coalition perspective is because my expectation is that the pro-PT bloc in the lower house that's now at 28% is going to get to around 35%. Okay. The PT is at 70 seats, but PT leaders tell me that they're expecting to elect anywhere between 90 and 100 this election, and I think they probably will, because they have the basis of support in the Northeast, and the PSDB are going to lose seats, right? So ceteris paribus, the anti-Serra bloc is going to be inching above 30% both in the lower house and the Senate. In other words, he's going to have a hard time, I think, mustering constitutional majorities in comparison to Rousseff, right? So that's the one. I think the difference. I mean, I think that you're absolutely correct, Claudio, in your appraisal. But I think that the magic number here for the opposition bloc is that if it gets above 30%, it gets more. You know, it's a higher cost. Now, I do think that overarching coalition, though. I mean, I think that if the leftist bloc grows in size and the PT gets to 90 to 100, I think that it does diminish the leverage of the PMDB. The PMDB's leverage has been, they've been able to enact such a high price because the government really needs the PMDB to overcome the opposition's veto in the Senate. Now, that's why the Senate PMDB has been stronger than the lower house PMDB over the course of the Lula administration, because I do take issue a little bit with the fact that the ability to enact a high price is in part a function of the veto threat from the opposition. If you diminish that in the Rousseff administration, in theory, you know, the price that they have to pay to the PMDB will diminish, but that's going to be a very difficult relationship to manage for sure.
Okay, do you want to say something?
No, I totally agree with Chris. I just want to take a look again. This other graph. I think that perhaps the main problems will have not to do with Dilma's personality and Dilma's relationship with the PT, because she's, of course, she's not Lula, she's not even Serra, because she's not trained in the political negotiation, but she's not stupid, on the other hand. And so she can learn. She can learn, as Chris has said, and so I believe that she won't have so important problems. But I think that the bigger problem has to do with the necessarily heterogeneity of the coalition. And João Paulo said something about the ministers that were clashing together, different ministers inside the same administration. One of them is pro-environment, the other one is against environment. And it has to do with the political system of Brazil, because all these guys in yellow, they have different political positions. For example, the first one, the PMDB, is a catch-all, a totally catch-all party. You have people from the left, you have people from the right, you have people from the center, you have everything that you want there. And so you can have two different ministers for the same party, and they can have different opinions concerning the same subject. But on the other hand, if the PT is a leftist party, The PP, the eighth party in the list, used to be the supporter of the military dictatorship. But today, they are a part of the Lula's coalition. And so can you imagine this? The most leftist party in the country, the PT, has a partner inside the same coalition, which is the most rightist party inside the country. Yeah, this was the party of Paulo Maluf. And so, the difficult point is how to combine such a huge difference in ideological terms inside the same coalition. Of course, this difference is not so huge for all the subjects. If they were so different, it would be impossible for these parties to be together. So we can say that today the most leftists, they are more centered to the left, and the most rightists, they are more centered to the right. And mainly the conservative, or the so-called conservative parts here, PR, PTB, PP, PSC, and so on, these parts are much more traditional elite groups, traditional political elite groups, consortiums of political entrepreneurs, more than representatives of the organic right in Brazil. They are not this. And so it's possible for them to be inside the administration. But of course, there will be difficulties to combine sometimes some very specific issues with the whole positions inside the coalition. Lula is very skillful to do with this. He's really versatile, but I don't know if Dilma will be so skillful, at least in the beginning of the government. So she had to use some operators.
Okay, David, and then we go Margaret.
Going on the same theme of coalition building, Chris mentioned party switching, perhaps in 2010, 2011. The problem is the party loyalty imposition by the election court, which was totally overruled last year in August and September when we had some 40 people switching parties with no consequence at all. So my question is, what will happen with party switching from 2010 to 2011? Will the election court's imposition be totally forgotten or overruled? Or will some entrepreneur try to form a new political party in early 2011, which could attract many, many people because you have no conditionality on changing to a new party, whether that would happen or not?
Let's try to keep our answers brief so I can get all the people that anyone would like to.
Yeah. I believe that there was a very special situation in this most recent part switches. Why this? Because we are in a period that was very close to the elections. And so I don't think it would be worth it for the parties who lose representatives to go to the courts to ask the seats back. Because they will receive the seats back in a period of 3 or 4 months, in the end of the terms, if the courts were quick. But since the courts will be dealing this year with the elections, probably it will take a long time to appreciate all these petitions. And so I don't believe that it would be worth it. And I believe this is the reason why all the switches recently were overpassed. Not because the courts are not enforcing anymore the rule that they themselves decided, but because the parties themselves were not worried about asking for the seats back in this moment.
Yeah, let me collect the final questions here, so please.
Yes, Gretchen Small with Executive Intelligence Review. I'd like to throw a stink bomb in here in the sense that the projections that are being discussed about the election are based on the so-called abundance. And the so-called abundance in the Brazilian economic policy is based on the Brazilian role in the international carry trade at a time in which the international financial system is not repairing but blowing apart, as the discussions in Europe of what is not a Greece crisis, but a Spain and a UK financial crisis going on. You have discussions in Germany and other parts of Europe of blowing apart the euro being disintegrated. That the ability for Brazil's carry trade to continue even through the time of the elections can be called into doubt. And what does that do then to all the projections of what's going on here?
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Let me collect all the final questions here.
Thank you. First of all, Paulo, thanks for a tremendous pair of panels. My question, I have two very brief questions. One, to Chris, you addressed essentially the situation, the policy changes from the perspective of what I think was the foreign investor community. How do you see the reaction of a Brazilian private sector, or the posture of a Brazilian private sector addressing the two candidates? And then second, how do, and perhaps João Augusto, you would address this, how do you see Brazil's posture with respect to an UNASUR, the South American Defense Council, everybody in Latin America except the North, and some of these initiatives in a new administration?
And finally, Cliff, and then we will go to answers and close.
Quick question concerning the abundance thesis. Is pre-sol already having effect on that, on policymakers? In other words, are they looking at the pre-sol as a blank check already? I just want your reaction to that.
Okay. How do we do this? João, do you want to go first with answering to Margaret's questions?
Yeah. Well, on the South American integration, I don't believe there will be fundamental differences between both candidates on, for example, the idea of undoing Mercosur or undoing the regional institutions, because I think the cost of that would be too much, it would be too high, and I don't think it would be a priority for either candidate, either president, whoever's elected, to try to tackle that issue. Also because with Argentina, integration is not only a matter of trade, but a matter of security and defense, nuclear security and defense, actually, because we have the treaty with them that ended our nuclear parallel programs. So so I believe that for Dilma, I think would be more of the same on Dilma, if Dilma is elected. I think she would have somewhat the same rhetoric on never before in the history of this country have seen so much integration and all that. A little bit too much integration for too small a continent. We have 4 or 5 legislative bodies in the continent. There's a Parliament of Mercosur, Parliament of the Andean Community, and Parliament of UNASUR, and so on, just as an example. So I believe we see much more of the same from Dilma's point of view, but from Serra's viewpoint, I think that, as I've said, he'll try to maybe settle a few trade disputes with Argentina, because that's the main axis, that's the main issue of South American integration on economic point of view. Without that, you'll have a kind of like a Swiss cheese UNASUR or Mercosur, with Venezuela going in, the bloc with exceptions and all that. So I think he won't undo things, but I think he'll put a break on more expansions and lessen a little bit the ideological rhetoric of Bolivarian against, I think he'll be more pragmatic on that issue.
Yeah, Claude, do you want to go next? Or do you, okay.
No, yeah, thank you for the questions. I'll just take them quickly in order. With regard to the thesis of kind of economic abundance, and essentially what you're asking is that if global international economic conditions can change, can the appraisal of the relative abundance also be undermined? My quick answer is no. I don't think so. I think it would be very hard to undo so, and because I think that the economic story in Brazil goes beyond international economic liquidity conditions, and even goes beyond high commodity prices, which actually, when you look at it from the downside risk from international markets, it may be more tied to commodity prices and China's growth story than anything else, given that Brazil is such a high commodity exporter to China. But it's very interesting to see how did Brazil respond to the global downturn we had last year. Right, and we had the global financial crisis hit in September, and the economy screeched to a relative grinding halt of 0% in growth. Right, the huge liquidity problems in the domestic market. Right, and financing for Brazilian companies, and in September of last year, 1 year into the global downturn, Ibope made a poll and asked voters, do you think 2009, right, has been excellent, good, regular, bad, or horrible year? 80% of Brazilians said that 2009 had been, from January through September, an excellent or very good year. Exactly Lula's approval ratings. Growing at 0% with liquidity problems. And why is that? It's the demographic transformation of the growth of the middle class. There's been a huge benefit to middle class voters and expansion in living conditions, and voters are going to remember that. So I think that that's going to carry into the elections. It's very hard to think of a scenario that is going to be worse than last year in a manner that can undermine all this economic good sentiment. I think maybe that's an issue more going forward. Right? So that's number one. Brazilian private sector. Clearly, Brazilian private sector is more concerned about this election than foreign investors. And actually, there isn't a consensus over which is worse. Because they're talking about the Serra risk. The Serra risk because, the financial sector is saying, oh, Serra is more interventionist. He's critical of the monetary policy. He is Serra is so centralizing that he will be the Minister of Finance and he will be the central bank president, right? And so there's more uncertainty on some macroeconomic policy in comparison to Rousseff, but there's more concern on industrial policy for Rousseff in comparison to Serra. So very interesting in São Paulo from the financial investor community. There isn't a clear uniform call that one is better or worse than the other, although I think that on the aggregate there is more rooting for Serra in comparison to Dilma. With regard to how much is the pre-salt influencing the abundance, I think a little bit yes, but I think that's more at the margin, to be honest, because I think that at the end of the day, what's driving this is that policymakers you need a lower and lower fiscal adjustment to keep the debt per GDP ratio declining. And given the composition of the debt and growth and revenue, and that's really what's generating all the political dynamic of a different agenda in Congress, difficulty of doing reforms and whatnot. So if Brazil, for example, had high fiscal solvency issues today, and they had to do difficult things to keep macroeconomic, the macroeconomy in line, and then you had the promise of oil revenue. And the revenue will come after 2015, 2020, right? That's when peak production will come. So I don't think that we would have quote-unquote irresponsible behavior today, given the expectation of revenue 10 years down the road. So I think it's, but it certainly it contributes to it, but I don't think it's a driver.
Thank you. Anything? Okay. Well, I wanted to thank you, Claudio, Chris, João, also to David, Cliff, Alberto. A special thanks to Renata Johnson, to Amanda Early, Renata Johnson, the program assistant. Amanda is the intern here at the program. They were instrumental in putting this program together. We will soon have the video of this. By the way, thank you, Anthony, for taping this for us. We are going to edit the video and put it online with the PowerPoints, with the summary of this, so you will continue to have access to the information here. We may do it again closer to the presidential elections when we will verify if the predictions here are correct or not. I would insist with you, do not bet anything of great value other than maybe a dinner on the outcome, because this thing is probably going to remain very tight and very uncertain. And I think we can say it's probably going to go to a second round, right? The probability, is that correct? Okay. Yes, and so thank you very much. And the next program here will be on the 19th of this month in the morning, talking about IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa. We will have a session with the ministers of labor of the three nations, talking about policies to combat child labor in their respective countries. Thank you very much.